Ve artık rapora başlayalım. Biraz rapordan bahsedelim. Ben ULI Avrupa CEO'su Lisette van Doorn'u buraya davet ediyorum. Bize ana başlıklarını bahsedecek raporun. Sonrasında da panelle birazcık daha derinlerini göreceğiz. Lisette, please. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Harrison. Thank you, Greg, for the nice introduction and the overview of Istanbul. I think probably today I will be the only person hardly talking about Istanbul. So I hope you bear with me for the next, say, 20-25 minutes, giving you the overall picture of the real estate investment management trends across Europe. Presenting the Emerging Trends report, which is already a long tradition between PwC and ULI, and we are very happy with the collaboration, as this produces such a high quality report. This year we got over 550 responses from all across Europe, of which 316 personal interviews. I think that's massive. I don't think there's any other report that produces that broad perspective of how we see the next 12 months working. I want to thank all of you that have contributed to the report, either by taking interviews or by responding to those interviews. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. What I would like to do now is to I would like to, before that, I'll first say a few words, because one thing important to note, and I think we'll see that back in the discussions later on as well, is this survey was done in the period from September to November. That's almost 6 months ago. A lot has happened in the meantime. So I think if we see the results now, things might have changed already. And that's always the challenge with a survey like this, especially the more extensive you want to do, the longer it takes to finish it. So it would be interesting later on to hear from you. First of all, do you recognize the main results and the main intentions that people have highlighted? And do you think the answer would still be the same if we look at it now? Let's first have a look at the business prospects. And the general picture that arises from these results, and not only from these, I'll come back to that later, that the majority of the respondents is still very positive about the business prospects for 2016. But people are becoming more cautious. If you compare it to what they said a year ago, they were far more positive than they are now. Don't get me wrong, they are still positive, because that blue bar that you see is still quite tall. It's a considerable percentage. And it goes for all the different three elements: business confidence, profitability, and business headcount. But we see people starting to get more cautious in, will those capital flows still continue? What will markets do? What will foreign investors do? Well, most people still think it's going to be better. And if we then take a first look at the business environment for 2016, we see that 39% of the respondents think that the European economy will further improve. That's also exactly the element that they are most positive about. And maybe we should go back 1 year, because a year ago, the main results that came out of the report were that capital flows were very strong, but in many countries across Europe, there were strong hesitations whether economic growth could close that gap between the strong capital flows and the yield developments that we were seeing, and whether we would see underlying economic growth coming up. That hesitation seems to have disappeared completely, especially if you look at these results. Many people think that economic growth will be a main driver behind that business environment. People are a bit more say moderate in their responses when answering to political uncertainty, cost of finance, and the availability of prime assets. Availability of prime assets comes out as a main issue, as you can also see when looking at issues impacting on their business. This is perceived to be the main issue, the scarcity and the unavailability of suitable and prime assets. And that's immediately followed by the changing fundamentals in the occupier demands and the underlying real estate market. So those two elements are being felt as most important affecting people's businesses. And that we asked a specific question on those assets. Then you see that 63% thinks prime assets are overpriced. And that is an element that we see also coming back later on when we look at, okay, but if they think prime assets are overpriced, where are they investing then? Moving on to the business profitability in prospects in 2016, I'll come back to the point I just made on positive prospects for economic growth. You see especially positive prospects in those countries that have only just come out of that financial crisis. Like, for example, Spain, Portugal, Greece has a positive prospect. And you could also say, well, the base is low, so it's going to be at least somewhat better. Well, not surprisingly, I would say, but remarkably, the UK is still also expected to perform very strong. As well as Ireland, which we've also seen being hard hit by the crisis. All in all, business profitability across Europe is expected. If you compare all of those countries, we hardly see any red bars, which is a very positive sign. So overall, people think the business environment will at least stay the same, if not improve further. Only Russia, and as you can see, some people here in Turkey, and I would like to hear more about that later, think otherwise, although only a small percentage for Turkey. That many players are starting to become somewhat more cautious is also especially visible when we look at the availability of debt and equity. Again, comparing that to last year shows interesting results. If we would only look at this year, you would say, wow, everyone is really positive, with majorities thinking more capital will be available, both equity and debt, for both investment and development. If you compare it, however, to last year, then you see those results moderating somewhat. And that also came out in the interviews that we held with many of you and others. People are starting to become a bit more cautious, a bit more wait and see what others are doing and how the market will be evolving. The only exception to this moderate view is debt for development, where a few years ago that was completely not done at all, and the percentages were even much lower. This is really, we relate this really to prime assets being overpriced. What we see happening in the market now is that investors start to search for other ways to get access to those prime assets. And one way to do that is through development. That's also what we asked them. And 78% of them agreed with that statement. And it goes even that far that we now even see institutional investors, so sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, taking on development risk. That was not done at all, say, 5-10 years ago at all. They only bought turnkey, the development risk belonged somewhere else. So we see a strong need to acquire prime, and they also see that as a very good way to acquire prime assets for the long term, and then for the short term take that development risk. They even take shares in the corporate of developments to get access to that development risk and longer term good portfolios of real estate. So that's a very interesting trend that we haven't really seen before. If we now look at where the capital is coming from, we again see similar pictures as we saw before. Again, a more moderate view. In expectations, this question asks, do you think the cross-border capital from the different origins, the Americas, Europe, and Asia, will increase into the investment in Europe? These percentages show you the people that answered. I think it will either moderately increase or strongly increase. So again, looking only at this year's result, the results are very positive. The majority thinks those amounts will increase for next year. Comparing it to last year, however, we can start to become a bit more moderate. And I would also guess that the answers now would be different from 6 months ago, especially if you look at the money coming from Asia. What also shows that more defensive view is that a higher percentage thinks that the money will stay in Europe. So it's not going to go out, because before that money was going to go out. So more people think, almost half of the respondents think that more money will stay in Europe. But now we've talked a lot about the general business environment, where the money is coming from, what people think. Most interesting thing, obviously, is where's that money going to? Which sectors, which countries, which cities? And these results and rankings that I'm going to show you in the next few minutes show some interesting perspectives. Because at one point, at the one hand, they show very clearly the point in the cycle where we are, where we've seen huge capital flows coming into the market, generally in Europe, already over the past few years. We have seen prime assets becoming more expensive. Investors still have a strong need to acquire prime, so they look for alternative ways to acquire that prime. In many cases, they want that core real estate over the longer term, and we've seen more go via the development route. What we are also seeing is they choose different kind of sectors. At the same time, however, we see these results also clearly showing a fundamental shift within the real estate sector in response to some of the mega trends that we have already been monitoring for a few years. But we've never seen such a clear picture into preferences as we are seeing this year. And I'll show that to you in a minute. The mega trends that we are closely monitoring and which are really becoming visible in investment intentions are obviously urbanization, demographic shifts, and technology. Let's now first have a look at cities, which shows us some interesting developments. Among investors, the shift, and I think Greg has already made that also very clear, the shift to a city has become truly mainstream. Say about 5-10 years ago, investors concentrated on countries. They've completely moved away from that. They only look at cities because they recognize cities are the ultimate driver of their investment performance. The next question would then be which cities? And in that respect, we asked the question how important placemaking is for investment performance. Greg before spoke a lot about density and the importance of that for cities. And you see that concept of placemaking is being recognized much more than we've seen that in the past. 66% of the respondents think that placemaking is the most important factor for real estate performance. And we also know that's easier said than done. Greg already shared some of the challenges with us, but the most important challenge is how to accommodate all those different people and companies now moving back to cities without making the same mistakes as we did in the past, and ensuring that the place is livable, vibrant, sustainable, and well connected. And now I'm going to show you a slide that you've already seen before. And as Greg also pointed out, we've done a lot of research into this. And we should say, on behalf of ULI, Greg did a lot of research on this for us. On what drives density in the topic and what is good density. And we all know we need to build more compact, but based on the negative experiences in the past, like the suburban office districts, like the out-of-town shopping centers, social housing blocks, all in common that they were built without any proper connectivity to the other parts of town and without any amenities making it possible to stay within the area. The general perception we all have about density is fairly negative. It was quite interesting when we did those workshops also here in Istanbul. Also, all of us, we have a different perception when we're constructing as a profession or when we're looking at the issue as a private individual. And that the not in my backyard issue is quite a substantial one to tackle. So what we've come up with is a sort of qualitative definition of density based on a number of core elements, part of good density, like green space, mixed use, spacious, built over time, mixing of income groups and population groups, well-connected, vibrant, and livable. So a place where you can live, work, sleep, and entertain yourself. And these results also came back in the emerging trends results, because we asked occupiers what different elements had most impact on their space requirements over the next 3 to 5 years. And then you see a lot of elements which are, I would say, not directly connected to the building itself. Where in the past it was, say, the building and immediate surroundings, it's much more about what's going on around it, being linked to other innovative companies, being part of a bigger, say, entrepreneurial atmosphere, if you will, being well connected, provide flexible working, and urbanization of businesses. So being inside the city instead of being outside. But now, of course, you want to know what the rankings are. And if we now look at the top 10 city ranking in Europe, we see that a relatively large number of the cities in this top 10, among which Berlin, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Munich, Copenhagen score very well on some of the elements that we've just seen. So what we see here is not just the point in the cycle you say, well, London has become really expensive, so we're not going there anymore. We also see specifically those cities, and not all of them are the biggest ones, where investors want to invest, say, of the placemaking element. In the US, they call these cities 18-hour cities. And we think that's quite an interesting description, which would also very well fit these kind of cities. It's not the global mega cities that we're talking about, London, well, Istanbul, but it's more the cities that somewhat smaller, but a very nice combination of live and work. And which sectors are being considered as most interesting? The impact of urbanization, but also changing demographics and technology are clearly visible when we are analyzing the most preferred sectors. One of the key outcomes this year was a very strong preference for residential, varying from housing, student housing, retirement living, to build for rent, or house building for sale. And therefore, we asked people what they now think about residential, because a few years before, and that's only very recently, residential was not considered an investment class at all, except for, say, a few countries here and there in Europe, which have a long tradition due to other reasons. But now it's really quickly grown into a mainstream real estate investment sector. 4 out of the top 10 sectors are related to residential in one way or another. 73% of those surveyed think that now residential can be perceived as a mainstream investment sector. And besides residential, which obviously is strongly supported by the demographic changes that we're rapidly seeing coming through, we see a significant shift to alternative sectors, where most of the sectors require considerable operational management, such as hotels, data centers, and healthcare. We asked people about the opportunities for alternatives. And then you see that 65% of the respondents think that alternative sectors offer good opportunities. Even 41% of them think they are even thinking about starting to invest in alternatives. Last year that was only 28%. And the main reason for considering alternatives has again to do with those mega trends. Demographic demand drivers driving that demand for alternative sectors, as answered by 66% of the respondents. If we now look at the top 10, as I said, 4 out of the 10 are related to residential. Then we have a large number of alternative sectors like data centers, hotels, healthcare. The only, say, 2 mainstream sectors, if I can call it like that, are high street shops and logistics. And again, we see a strong, say, megatrend driver behind that in the sense of e-commerce and technology. And the development to take on more operational risk by real estate players is an interesting one. Because to be successful, the alignment between the operator and the owner-manager needs to be much stronger than is currently often the case in practice. I would like to cite one interviewee who said during the interview, lack of alignment between how owners, managers and occupiers see a well-performing building is an issue. There needs to be new language around this. Performance needs to be defined as something that supports occupiers' differing aims. Landlords need to support the value creation side of their tenants' business. This also comes back to Isa's earlier point, is the way we look at buildings is changing rapidly. ULI has recently done and launched research that focused on the impact of technology and the innovation economy on the real estate sector. And the most important conclusions were that the real estate sector obviously needs to adapt to the rapidly changing complex needs of the innovation economy. And we looked specifically at the innovation economy because that's a very clear leading change agent in real estate. Not only on the demand side, as they have very different needs than traditional tenants used to have, also on the supply side. Because at the same time, they're becoming a competitor or a service provider, if you will, to the traditional real estate sector. If you look at what Airbnb does, what Liquid Space does, what other types of technology companies do, which is having a very strong impact on how the real estate sector operates. We identified 4 different ways in which the real estate industry should respond. First of all, it should adopt much more of a service provider mindset. We see, for example, many people with more psychology type of background, sociology type of backgrounds coming into the real estate sector. Much more looking at real estate as one of the services provided to tenants and companies. Be prepared for continuous adaptation, feedback, and complexity. Real estate operators must develop new business models that allow for tailor-made solutions when it comes to access, location, workplace, building layout, and rental terms. And things will constantly continue to change. And as I just also mentioned, align interest and build transparency between owners and occupiers. Landlords should become collaborating partners with tenants. Ultimately, the success of the tenant drives the success of the building. and provide hands-on stewardship to address the broader framework of innovation. And many of those surveyed for emerging trends confirmed these conclusions. Someone said 20 years ago we had tenants, now we have customers, and in 20 years' time we will have guests. These developments are going very fast, influenced by technological developments such as big data, digitalization, giving tenants the tools to value real estate in a more new and complex way. The role of buildings is clearly changing, and it's much more linked to productivity. Is the tenant able to perform in the building? One interviewee said, who I would like to cite, there's an increasing realization that there's value to the way a building is run, rather than what rent is paid and what covenant it has. And therefore we ask people what they think is the impact of technology on the way we use buildings. And you see that 85% of the respondents thinks that technology will change the way we use buildings. And 50% even thinks that how we use buildings is more important than the building itself. And now, before I close, I would like to share a short video with you that we have developed based on a very detailed and, extensive discussion session that ULI did last year, where our global leadership came over to Paris and worked for 3 days on developing thoughts and how these kind of mega trends like urbanization, technology, demographics will impact the real estate sector. I would like to share that with you.
Around the world, our communities are constantly changing, ever expanding, ever improving, ever changing to reflect the different ways people live, work, and play. ULI and its members are committed to guiding this certain change. In 2015, nearly 150 senior industry leaders were invited to Paris to participate in ULI's first ever Trustees and Key Leadership meeting.
He's transformed Rome, in some ways pedestrianizing famous boulevards.
Their goal, to examine the transformational changes underway in our modern world and create a vision and action plan for the future of our industry that touches on key themes of leadership, technology, investment, housing, regulation, flexibility, respecting our natural resources, education, and outreach.
We are changing our habits.
Solving the new leadership equation, if you remember nothing else, remember this. You have to focus more management time and attention on those right brain skills of social interaction, empathy, and creativity.
Discussions of rapidly changing technology and its influence on urban infrastructures around the world abounded at the midwinter meeting.
You know, the speed of change it's accelerating. When you get rapid change, it's far more difficult to understand what the implications are and how to deal with it.
As shared financial interests continue to grow across continents, ULI members at the midwinter meeting examined how to help promote a free flow of ideas to investors around the world.
In the emerging markets, in particular, I think the densification issue for ULI members is really core to sustainability issues, but also investment issues.
Meeting attendees discussed the need to improve affordable and accessible housing in order to cultivate thriving communities.
Demographics, I think, has always been a big driver for the market, but we're really only just learning about it and the impact it has on property. And the more we learn about demographics, the more we'll understand the property needs. And I think that that really is the challenge for real estate.
We've got a massive population boom and an insatiable need for more connectivity.
We have incubators, we have accelerators, we have proof of concept labs, and we're really starting to see that edge that I think a city wants with its younger people that keeps it really vibrant and looking sharp.
A city is going to be environmentally friendly if a city works.
Urban advancement is tied to the impact of governance. And leaders at the midwinter meeting emphasized the need to create new public-private collaborations that serve both the public and the industry.
You've got to get at the table and you've got to show how a city can finance a lot of this stuff itself. And I believe that tax increment financing is the way forward.
Attendees also highlighted another problem plaguing many modern cities, the lack of flexibility.
Our view of the future is that we don't produce a national top-down plan as to how care is to be delivered in the future. Our view is that we set out what we think are better models of care that will be more efficient and better wrapped around patients, but that they will be designed in localities.
At the meeting, leaders discussed how this philosophy of flexibility extends beyond just adaptability in urban environments to embracing and respecting our natural resources.
Sustainability and resilience and climate change. These issues are absolutely crucial for the future. Therefore, we really need to know about this stuff and change the way in which we work.
Simply developing new understandings of the ever-changing urban landscape is not enough, however. That's why education and outreach remain an important component of ULI's work.
In addition to smart regulation, we're going to need a host of creative new policy reforms and also new cross-industry fora to debate and share best practices, as you've been doing here.
Through discussions at the midwinter meeting, ULI sparked the beginnings of a new action agenda, a new set of ideas that will guide the industry and the modern world going forward.
If you can build cities...
It's not finished yet. Well, you just missed the last tiny bit, so for the sake of time, let's skip it. I hope it did give you a nice impression about more of the work we've done on this topic. And I would like to close, because I think everyone's up for a coffee, with kind of the food for thought that I will not comment on this. I'll just put it up on screen for the discussion later on. And I would like to close. Thank you very much.